There are many Bible stories that we are very familiar with. And then there are some that we don't really think about unless someone draws our attention to them. Today, we're going to look at, in the book of Esther, chapter 9, and verses 18 through 32, and read about the Feast of Purim. Now, I want to begin with kind of the backstory, what's going on here. And, you may be very familiar with the book of Esther. You may be very familiar with the story of Mordecai and Haman, and how Haman had a plan to destroy the Jews, and he had a gallows built to hang Mordecai on. And through Esther, God really intervened with the king. And as it turned out, instead of Mordecai being hung on those gallows, it was Haman himself who was hung there on the gallows. And so that's kind of what's going on here in chapter Esther 9, is that those events have just taken place. And it's really a passage in the Bible when we get to Esther 9 where the Jews have overcome their tormentors, overcome those that would take them down. And so we find ourselves there looking at this, and they've just won a major victory. And God has really moved on their behalf. And so we come to the Feast of Purim, and that we start reading about that in verse 18. But the Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day, as well as on the 14th, and on the 15th of the month they rested and made a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled town celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting, as a holiday and for sending presents to one another. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far, who were in all the provinces of King, I'm sorry, I can't read with the light here, King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast pur, that is the lot, to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that his sons should be hanged on the gallows. So they called these days Purim, after the name Pur, or Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter that they had seen concerning this matter and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed upon themselves and their descendants, all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year, according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that those days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their generations. And I'm going to stop there for just a moment and kind of fill some of this in. So Purim is taken from P-U-R, pure, or lots. And this is, when they talked about casting lots, they used to cast lots. They were small stones that they would use and throw out to define God's will or find God's will. And, we may do some more study in the near future on this finding God's will kind of thing. Because it's a tricky business for many today, figuring out what does God want me to do? What is the right thing? But they used lots. They would throw lots to find God's plans, if you will, find what was the right thing, to make choices. And too often, I think we want to rely on something else to make the choice, something else to make the decision rather than ourselves. Maybe because we don't want to deal with the accountability of our choices. I don't know. But if we can blame it on something, many years ago, comedian Flip Wilson, said the devil made me do it, right? That was his answer. Well, the devil made me do it. And the reality is we're always looking for something we can blame. Well, that's just the way it is, or it's the government caused this, or, is my boss is the reason I had to do it that way, or whatever it might be. Okay. So God's plans. And so they would cast lots in order to find the right thing. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along here. In the meantime, I want to get back to God's plans. God's plan, and we see it over and over in Scripture, God's plans include provision. God's plan is to provide for his people. God's plan is to provide for his people, a plan of provision. And that comes through in so many different ways, but I always go right back to the 23rd Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd and I shall not want. And that really means I shall not have need. In other words, I won't have lack. In other words, he will provide. And then God's plan includes protection. It includes protection for his people. And we see that also in the 23rd Psalm when he says, that he leads me beside the still waters. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Because, why? He's with me. His rod and staff, they comfort me. So God provides provision, protection, and salvation. And salvation is really the beginning of our relationship with Christ. But God has been there all along, waiting for us to come to that point, that place in time when we're going to let him be Lord. And he can begin to provide all those things. And people will tell you, I got saved, but I know God was watching out for me before even that he had a plan for my life because I was protected from this, or he took care of me in this area, or what have you. So God's plans are good. God's plan includes love. He loves us. And when we're in God's will and we're in God's plan, there is love one for another. That's what the Bible tells us, that we would have love one for another. And God's plan is that we would have ministry to others, that God would use us to minister to others. That's what we find when we talk about overcoming by the blood of the Lamb. That's what he's done. And the word of our testimony, that we're out testifying to his goodness, and that is going to impact other people. That's really the crux of God's plan. Provision, protection, salvation, love, and ministry. Now, there's more facets, and you could maybe say it different ways or what have you, but that's kind of the key pieces there. And as we're looking at this story in Esther, we can see that God has done all of these things in this series of events that have happened in Esther, that he has in fact provided, that he has in fact protected, that he has in fact saved, that he has in fact brought love. And that's kind of this festive feast that they're going through, giving presents and celebrating, and through that ministering one to another. You can see how Esther is ministered to the king and whatnot. So there's things that are happening that are all right in God's plan. So we get to this Feast of Purim, the Feast of Lots. Now, the Feast of Lots is a minor Jewish holiday, but it's one that's celebrated. And the Feast of Lots is a type of revival, if you will. In other words, one of the things that Feast of Lots, one of the things with lots is you could use casting lots to decide if something was sinful behavior or something was wrong behavior or not. And of course, revival is when we recognize sinful behavior and we turn to God. Lots could also be used and be cast in terms of the harvest of inheritance. How land was divided and doled out through inheritance or some other means. It was, how should the land be done? We'll cast lots for the land. And lots were also used sometimes to determine what was an appropriate sacrifice. What's the right sacrifice? So cast lots. And like I said, I think in the near future we may do a little deeper study on defining God's will, because it's one of those things that people struggle with, is knowing what to do, knowing what would God want me to do. We had the phrase that went around in such a big way a number of years ago, what would Jesus do? And there is the problem, I think, sometimes. We can say the phrase, and that's good to put our focus on what would Jesus do. But the problem is, a lot of times I think many people don't know what Jesus would do. They think they might know. They know God is love, so they're pretty sure that's going to be a factor. But then they run into things like where Jesus went and cleared out the temple of the money changers and turned over tables and, tied knots and rope and swung them around and ran people out. That doesn't quite line up with the love picture in their mind. But it does line up with things that aren't of God. So how do we get to things that aren't of God and get in the right place? And there's some things I want to talk about with relationship to tending the altar. We've talked about being present and tending the altar and being real and not pretending, and being able to minister to others at the altar, but being able to lead them to Christ, being able to exhort them, teach them, and to help define or help find God's will on a corporate scale. So we're right back to that same tending the altar here with the Feast of Purim. And the feast itself begins with the reading of the entire book of Esther. The whole story, kind of recapping, remembering, and bringing that story back to the forefront of our mind. As I said when I started today, there's Bible stories that we're very familiar with, and then there's the ones we don't really think about unless someone draws our attention to them. So here's a feast that's built around a Bible story that we may not just think of right off the top of our heads. Maybe we think of Daniel in the lion's den, or we think of Noah in the ark, or we think of Moses in the desert or whatever, but we don't necessarily think of the story of Esther, and we don't necessarily think of this particular part of the story. And so they would read the entire book of Esther at the beginning there. It's only, a handful of chapters, 10 chapters long. And as they would read it, when Mordecai's name would come up, they would cheer. They would cheer the good. We need to recognize the good in the story that God's telling. We need to recognize the good in the story that God is doing in our lives. We need to recognize the good. They would cheer the good. Mordecai, yay, hooray. We would talk about, Mordecai, that's good. And then when Haman's name was read, they would use noisemakers or boo, essentially. And the reason for that was to blot out the evil Haman from being even heard, his name even being spoken. So, the reality is, we talk sometimes about not recognizing evil, and then we'll go into great detail about evil and almost reverence it. No, we need to cheer the good. We can blot out the evil. Not because we're afraid, not because we can't handle it, but because we don't want to glorify it at all, blotting out the evil. And then we need to remember God. We need to remember who it is that provides the provision and the protection and the salvation and the love and the ministry, and who it is that's good. Truly good is God. That's part of that process we need to go through. And there's an aspect of this as we look at it, the king in the story, he didn't recognize the wickedness of Haman right off the bat. He didn't recognize the plans that were not good plans at all. Didn't really see what was going on. And part of hearing God's voice and part of being able to minister at the altar, if you will, is the discerning of spirits. The ability to recognize when something is not right, when something is not of God. And I am not in favor of casting lots. I think God speaks to us, and certainly through the New Testament, we have access to the King of Kings. We have access to read, hear from God about his will. We don't have to cast lots. We can go to God and ask. And we can hear his plan. And there are times when I think we struggle to hear God's voice. There's times when we struggle to recognize things that are out of order. But the closer we get to God, the more time we spend reading his word, the easier it is to spot the counterfeit, the easier it is to spot the wrong, the easier it is to spot the lie. His word is truth. The closer we are to truth, the easier it is to spot the false. And the Feast of Purim was also celebrated during the harvest. And it was during the flax harvest in particular, which is something used primarily for making candle wicks. And it was also used for the priest's garments. And as it's woven, they go to great lengths to soften and pound the plant pulp away from the stringy flax fibers. And so, again, it's representative of this idea of revival, of the softening of to pull out what is good and useful during this feast. And focus on the good, blot out the evil, remember God in all things. That's all part of what was going on in the feast and the symbology and how it ties to revival. But it also ties to God's salvation from our enemies. In other words, here the plan of the enemy was for Mordecai to hang, and yet it was he and his family who hung on those gallows. Why? Because God intervened. Because God stepped in and turned the evil plan around. What was meant for evil, God turned into good. And that's one of the things he promises to us. And it's one of the things that we need to hang on to is instead of waiting for the other shoe to drop, instead of waiting for the other thing to go wrong, we need to remember God's plan of provision, protection, salvation, love, and ministry. And we need to be waiting for God to move. We need to be waiting to see God do the next great thing. That's where we need to be focused is God, what are you going to do next, God? Remembering God, remembering good, bringing that to the forefront of our thought. Flax is used to make, as I said, candle wicks to burn brightly. Let our light shine, that we can shine for God, the good. This is all tied to the idea, again, of tending the altar, of the whole series of tending the altar. How am I going to live my life out? And we can talk about things like, positive thought. And there's nothing wrong with positive thought. It's much better to think positively than it is to think negatively. There are people who walk around thinking negatively all the time. They can never see the good. we need to focus on the good. We need to focus on God. And as we do that, we can tend the altar of our own life. We don't have to cast lots to figure out what's the appropriate sacrifice. We can be obedient to his word. The more time we spend in his word, the easier it is to discern what God would have us to do. The more time we spend in God's word, the easier it is to discern what is right. God has a plan. He has a plan for your life. God has a plan for your church. God has a plan for your city. God has a plan. And when we begin to seek God, Esther, part of what turned this whole thing around is Esther went before the king. She didn't even ask, which was in itself a risky business. Could be punished with death. But she went before the king and she petitioned with what was right, what was on her heart, found favor. And so we can come boldly, that's what the Bible tells us, we can come boldly to the throne of grace. We can come boldly to God and let him know our petitions. We can come boldly to God with praise, recognizing the good. But the reality is we have a place, we have an audience with the king. We need to realize how important that is, how significant it is that we have an audience with the king. We have the ability to pour our heart out to God, and he'll hear, and he'll answer, and he'll confound the enemy, and he'll turn what the enemy has meant for evil in our life and turn it to good. And I'm not talking about, you have the fastest, nicest car or the biggest bank account or anything. I'm not saying that. I'm saying in your life, the things that are truly important, God will turn to good. When we give it to him, when we truly make him Lord of our lives, he'll turn those things to good. He'll give us the opportunity to minister that information to those around us, that they too can be saved, that they too can come to have God win in their lives. So the Feast of Purim was an opportunity to remember the great thing God did, the great protection that he provided, how he turned and foiled the plans of the enemy, and to recognize one another with gifts of presence to one another and celebration and just, joyful remembrance of what God did and the goodness of God. Now, we have upon us what I call holiday season. That's where we have, Thanksgiving and Christmas and whatnot. And today is actually Halloween. As I'm standing here filming this, it's Halloween. And there's much debate about the church's position on Halloween. To me, it's very simple. I celebrate God. And he is the Lord over Halloween. And there's things you can take out of Halloween if you want that are good. And there's things that are evil. But you know what? You can cheer the good. And you can blot out the evil. And you can remember God in all things. You can celebrate God in all things. You can thank him for the harvest. You can thank him for the salvation of those that are lost in your family. You can thank him and praise him in advance for the great things that he's going to do. You can thank him in advance for how he's going to take the plans of the enemy and turn them around and bring salvation in your family. And you don't have to spend times on ghosts and goblins and witches and none of that stuff. But we can remember God in all of our holidays. We can give thanks for the harvest. We can give thanks for the bountiful harvest that he's given us in thanksgiving. And we can remember the gift of his Son, a Savior, Emmanuel, God with us, in December. And we can go right into New Year thanking God for his protection, his provision, his love, his salvation, all the things that he's done for us at the end of this year. And we can thank him in advance for the provision, the protection, the salvation, the love and the ministry that he has for us in the next year. So you can take any of these things, and if we get our focus in the right place, we can turn it into a feast of Purim. We can turn it into a feast of remembering and thanking God for all that he's done. And that's part of tending the altar. That's part of being present, being available for God to use, to be able to help direct people to God, help them access God, in order to not only improve our lives, but to bring them into that relationship with God that they need. And it can even help us figure out God's plan, again, for my life, for our family, for our church, for our community. The more we let God control, the easier it is to have God make things successful, the more peace we'll have. And, it's really, at the end of the day, it's just simply about a relationship with God. So I would encourage you today to make it a point to look for the good and cheer the good on. Blot out the evil. Remember God in all things. And keep tending that altar. And that's it for this week.